Okay.
Excellent.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to pull up my slides now. Thank you all for coming. Put it in slideshow mode. And can you all just confirm that you can see this okay? And for some reason, it's not wanting to go in slideshow mode. There we go.
There
okay.
we go.
Okay. So, hi, everyone. So as Gary mentioned, I am Eve Colson, and I am at Washington University School of Medicine, where I serve as the Associate Dean for Program Evaluation, Continuous Quality Improvement in the Office of Education. And I'm here with my colleague, Yaheng Lu, who, would you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, thank you. It's great seeing everybody here. I'm Yaheng Lu. I work with Dr. Eve Colson in our institution. I primarily focus on the program evaluation of the pre-clerkship phase. So great seeing everybody, and happy to chat about the continuous quality improvement.
Great. I think I can hear somebody's background, maybe some. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I have a few things that I am required to show. This is the CME statement about the credit statement and the disclosure statement for ACE. And also, I just wanted to point out that this is a faculty development series. There's already been, I believe, if I'm wrong about this, Gary, please step in, but I believe the 101 series has been completed.
Yep.
And now we're in the 201 version, and then we'll be moving into the 301 version. So I think a lot of these have been based on the book that I'm going to show you in a second. So the Faculty Development 101 series, there are recordings available, and here's the list for you of the different topics that were covered. And as I said, we're also now in the 201 series, and you'll see that I'm talking about with Yaheng the curriculum on quality improvement, and last time it was evaluation of the clerkship. And then there'll be a 301 series that I'm very much looking forward to and attending, and these are the topics there. So a lot of these are based on this guidebook for clerkship directors, and I'm going to be basing some of what I'm talking about today on the chapter called Using Quality Improvement Concepts to Improve Educational Curricula. And I was one of the authors, but there were many authors, and I just want to say that there's a lot of people who contributed to that chapter, and I'm going to borrow heavily from that chapter. And in addition, what we're really planning to do is to give you some real life examples from our own institution. So the objectives that we have today are that we hope that by the end, you'll be able to name at least 2 reasons for conducting continuous quality improvement, or CQI, to improve your curricula. List the components of the PDSA, or Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle that can frame your CQI approach, and also that you will be able to walk away thinking about how you might apply the PDSA cycle to an issue or issues at your own institution. And we're hoping to make this somewhat interactive. And so Yaheng will be monitoring the chat as we go through this when I'm speaking, and then I'll monitor it for her as she's presenting, so that we can get some group interaction to make sure to keep you guys awake. So the first thing that I wanted to just do is to sort of define what is continuous quality improvement, or CQI. And I will say that a lot of what I do is taken from the clinical version of CQI, which some of you may also know. Those of us who are working in the clinical setting know that we have a mindset to try to improve constantly on the clinical care that we provide. And we bring that similar way of thinking about things to the education setting. And so I looked at the different definitions, and I really like this one that I pulled in off of the internet, which is that CQI is the process of identifying, describing, and analyzing strengths and problems, and then testing and implementing, learning from, and revising solutions. So it's really an ongoing process ever thinking about how we might improve things. And so why would you want to do CQI? Well, first of all, for your own school. And the idea, like I said, for the clinical setting, of course, we always want to improve upon the clinical care that we provide. Similarly, we want to continually improve upon our education programs. So it's an iterative process. It never really ends. And then as someone who just went through and was the faculty accreditation lead for our LCME site visit on February 22nd, so recent memory, we do all know that the reality is that the LCME requires that we do CQI. And very specifically, the LCME asks that a medical school engages in ongoing strategic planning and continuous quality improvement processes that establish its short and long-term programmatic goals, result in the achievement of measurable outcomes that are used to improve education program quality and ensure effective monitoring of medical education program compliance with accreditation standards. So the bottom line is we want to do it because we're always wanting to improve what we do, and we kind of have to do it if we want to stay accredited. So I like to think of CQI as sort of a way of thinking about life, and it's a philosophy. It helps make things better, and it's kind of an attitude like, this is important, this is good, this is what we want to do. We want to constantly think about, is this going well? And if not, what we might do to change it and make it better. And this is I pulled this in from a cartoon. And you can see there, and Gary, I'll share the slides with you so people can pull up this YouTube. It comes from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, IHI, which I really love that website. It gives me good ideas about things that we can do. And this particular video is really fun, and it goes through why we like to improve things in the clinical space. And it also makes us think about how we can improve it in the education space. And in addition, I think it's important to come to CQI with a curiosity. Like, why isn't this thing that we were doing working well? Why is it that we're getting this feedback from students? Or why is it that this isn't exactly the way we hoped it would be? And trying to think about how to solve for those things. And it's just a really nice sort of foundational way of thinking about things and having a curiosity. So this is what I want to walk through. This is the way I think, and we think in our unit about continuous quality improvement. This is the framework that we use. It's the Plan, Do, Study, Act framework, or PDSA cycle taken from the IHI, or at least that's where I learned about it. And it's not the only way to think about it. It's not the only framework, but it's one that I like, I'm used to, and I've been working with, and seems to work well in the education space. So the first thing we do with the PDSA cycle, and I'm going to take you through this. By the way, how many of you have heard of the PDSA cycle? If you can just put in the chat if you've heard about this before. Anybody heard about it before? Oh, I see one thing in the chat, 2, 3, 4. Well, I don't know what people are saying, but what's happening in the chat, Yaheng?
Yes, we have many people indicating they have worked with the framework.
Great. Okay. So hopefully you'll see how we use it, and then you can add to that as we talk it through. And at the end, there should be some time for some discussion. So that'll be great. I'm going to walk you through how I think about it and how we think about it, how we use it. And then we're going to give you some examples of how we use it. We're going to talk about some data too. So there's the do part. So first you plan, then you do, then you study, and then you act. And so the planning part, the things I think about is you want to decide what it is that you want to improve. What changes do you need to make? Do you think that you need to make in order to make improvements? So that's kind of your needs assessment. And then how will you measure the change? So what data do you need? The next piece is doing. So you're putting the changes in place, you're measuring your outcomes, you're examining your processes. Then you want to make sure in the study piece that you conduct data analyses, create reports. And then finally, You want to present your data. You want to give your data to the people who need it. You want to create action plans and create an accountability plan. And for a lot of people, I know this is often the hardest piece to make sure that this all comes together. And we'll talk a little bit about how we try to systematize it where we are to make sure that the whole cycle happens and that we can keep cycling around. The other thing I just want to point out is that this isn't really a never-ending thing. Here we have an example of where you have your hunches and your theories and beginning to do the Plan, Do, Study, Act, and then you take this all the way and hopefully it's a straight line of improvement. I know for me, sometimes it's a bit of a roller coaster, hopefully ultimately getting to the point where the changes have made an impact. So the next thing I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the data sources that we use and that you might have at your own institution. So everybody knows we have lots of student satisfaction data. We collect a lot of that, talks about student satisfaction, student experiences, and we have internal data that are kind of at different spaces. So we collect internal data that is just-in-time feedback. So our students have the ability to really go to our learning management system and any place and any time, so long as they have access to their phone or computer, can give feedback to us about anything that they're experiencing. The place where students use this the most is within a given session. So usually in the pre-clerkship phase of our curriculum, when they're in a given session, they will usually go on and comment about that. And we don't get a ton of just-in-time feedback because it's optional, but we do get some, and it can be incredibly helpful. And when something goes incredibly wrong, we see the board light up and we monitor it on a daily basis. And so we can really quickly address something even so simple as some technological thing that either we didn't use right or didn't work well, that we can address really quickly, to other issues that come up that seem to strike a lot of students. But when things are settled and things are going generally well, we don't see a ton. We have been asking the students for not just constructive feedback, but positive feedback, and we've been getting a lot more of that. And that is also really helpful and inspiring for our educators. The second thing we do is we have systematic focus group opportunities, or what we call advisory groups, in place. So like today, we're running an advisory group for our module 4, where the students come and talk about their experiences. We ask them to reach out to other students so that we get a better sense of students at large. We give them information to students who come to talk about not just their own experiences, but make sure they meet and talk to other students, so bring opinions to the table from others. And then for the clerkships, we run it at every end of every clerkship, and it actually is required for all students on that clerkship. In addition, if we've got specific needs where we can't really do it in a group setting, like, for example, recently we had to explore a little bit more about our mental health services and felt that that may not be as useful in the group setting, we were able to do some in-depth interviews, or just interviews about the topic. We also have end of course surveys and end of phase surveys. And of course, we all get the external Y2Q and GQ information. But in addition, we have other sources of data. So internally, we have aggregated assessment data, for example, that we can look at for grades, or in our case, competency determinations. But we have a learning management system where we use keywords to look at content or track EPOs versus learning objectives for mapping. We also have external data that comes in, obviously, from the match results, the NBME subject exams, program director surveys, and residency milestones that we look at. So this is an example of, so we use both quantitative and qualitative data. I think that the mix is super important because the quantitative data tells you one thing, it tells you how many. So this is an example of just a figure that I pulled in, that we will often share something like this with our leaders. and at various meetings. So this is an example. Some of you may recognize. How many of you recognize the very dissatisfied, dissatisfied, satisfied, and very satisfied NNA? That's how the LCME likes to look at their data. And so here you can see this is an example where we're looking at percentages on the y-axis and satisfaction on the x-axis. And we're also looking at 2020 and 2021. And so you can see that with an intervention, we've actually improved something from 2020 to 2021. And there were not a lot of not applicables. So that's important that we get a sense of how many people are either not participating or think it's not applicable to them. So we can get a sense of where we're at even before we would have an LCME site visit. And then, of course, there's the qualitative. So the quantitative can tell you how many, but it doesn't tell you what's really going on. So we use, as I said, survey narratives, focus groups, interviews to answer the question, what is going on? Why is it going on? How might we make a change? And so these are some comments from, for example, survey narratives that I brought in, that these are not the actual narratives, but maybe representative of what you might see. So the clerkship went well, it was organized, I knew what was expected of me, versus a comment of when, for example, you might ask about resident teaching or how they worked on the team. Maybe this will look familiar to you. The resident team ignored me. They had no idea. So I have no idea how they can possibly evaluate me. Or when we think about space in the clinical setting, and one student might say something like, there was no place for me to put my lunch on this rotation. So how many of you have seen comments along these lines? And I'm picking out some small ones and some minor ones, but sometimes they can really help you to get at, or at least to begin to get at where the issues are with regard to some of the problems that you're having and trying to solve. So the other thing I just wanted to point out is that we put, there's a ton of data that comes in, right? We all get so much data. So we use an organizational management software. This is called Monday.com. It isn't the only organizational software, but it's essentially, kind of gives Gantt charts to help us keep ourselves organized and systematize what surveys go out, what data we're collecting, where those data are going to go, who's going to see them, are they going to be presented in any kind of report, are they going to be presented to any type of committee. So that really helps keep our group, our team, our unit organized around this. And of course, we're collaborating with other units so we can share this board so they also know when we're doing what, because we may not even be organizing or when the presentations are going to occur. So we have to collaborate across units. And then we also have a specific CQI dashboard that thinks about the different standards and elements for LCME. And we look to see, how do we think we're doing? Is this a QI element? And this is really a dynamic board that we can change at any time. And we talk about what, have a column for alerts, why it is we would be wanting to follow a certain element more closely based on changes that we see or commonly cited or et cetera, along those lines. So that's how we also keep track of thinking about our QI processes specifically for the LCME. So I want to change a little bit here and pivot to actually giving some very specific examples of things that we've come across. So I wanted to talk a little bit about space in the clinical setting. So how are you all doing with space in the clinical setting? And specifically, this table from element 511, satisfaction with adequacy of relaxation space in the hospital or clinical sites. I think this could be one that's a challenge for many people. Any of you experiencing challenges or thinking about this in any way? Maybe put something in the comments, in the chat. Raise your hand if you're experiencing or thinking about things. See, there's something coming in the chat.
Yes, Sarah said they are monitoring this at U Michigan.
Okay. Well, Sarah, I don't think you're alone. I think this is a challenging one for everyone. And whether we like the question or not, we are obligated to think about it. So satisfaction with adequacy of relaxation space in the hospital and clinic, and specifically, we're supposed to, for the LCME, say whether the number and percentages of students who respond dissatisfied or satisfied with the adequacy of relaxation space in the hospital clinic. So as we were rolling up to our LCME, I will say that we were not surprised that this became an issue in our ISA, because we actually monitor this and other ISA questions on some of our internal surveys. And so we were already beginning to grapple with the fact that there was a lot of dissatisfaction around this. And so we put this as a high priority on our CQI projects. And so just moving through this, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we thought about this. And this is a relatively simple one. And I'm going to go through this one. And then Yaheng's going to talk about one that's a little bit more complicated. So we're going to have 3 examples for you, moving from the relatively straightforward, simple to a little bit more complicated. So in terms of planning, we knew that we had to think about how do you improve. Sorry, I'm going to go around here. So we had to decide, what do we want to improve? So we wanted to improve satisfaction with the relaxation space in the clinical setting. It wasn't an issue for us in the pre-clerkship phase, where we have actually great relaxation space. We have sleep pods, all sorts of things. So it's awesome. I want to go up and use those sleep pods sometime during the middle of the day. And then we had to know, well, how will we change? Like, what is the issue? We had to explore this. And what we found out was actually something really interesting, which was that we actually have some spaces that students can use for relaxation, but they didn't know about them pretty much on every clerkship. So we thought, oh, well, that's interesting. Okay. So initially we thought, oh gosh, how are we going to do this? Because we don't really think of the clinical space as a place to relax. But then we realized, actually, yeah, there were some spaces that students could have access to and should have access to, and probably didn't know about or even realize that they could go there. And so then we wanted to think about our measures. Well, we're going to think about both qualitative and quantitative data to see if whatever we implement could improve it. So what we did was we worked really closely with clerkship directors to make sure that we collected all the information. And so through newsletters and other ways of communicating, we let the students know, actually, you do have some relaxation space in the clinical setting. And then every clerkship during orientation, the clerkship directors would show them the relaxation space that they would have, tell them about it, and actually even take a tour with them. And then we had senior leadership, including our Associate Dean for Medical Education, Dr. Dean Tom Defer. Many of you may know him. He's awesome. And he would go around and do like spot checks and check in with the students. And that was our approach. And so then that's what we put into place. And we were going to measure the outcomes by putting that question in our end of clerkship survey to see if we were making any difference. And the nice thing about having it in the end of clerkship survey was that it allowed us to hotspot. So we could know, oh, we've been making a lot of improvement in the pediatric clerkship, but we're still having trouble with this one space or this one rotation in the medicine clerkship, for example. And we would do our data analysis at the end of every clerkship block. We created reports. We do send these to our clerkship directors, and we also have focus groups or our advisory groups in every clerkship, so we could let them know how we were making progress on this. And we can continually cycle after each block to make improvements in this area, and made sure to present the data, create action plans, create accountability about who will do what by when. And I'll tell you, actually, we fixed the problem. We were really excited and pleasantly surprised by our ability to really improve to getting dissatisfaction down to about 5% in these areas, just by actually figuring out what the problem was and making sure we had a good communication plan going forward. So I'm going to now hand this over to Yaheng. Yaheng, can you take over the screen, or do you want me to?
I think it might just be easier for you to advance the slide, since I only have 3 or 4.
Great, and I will keep monitoring the chat.
Okay, thank you so much, Eve. So in this example, we'd like to show you what we did to highlight the content integration, coordination, and the integration of the content specifically in the pre-clerkship. So we newly launched our curriculum Gateway, and our institution is in St. Louis, and the city is well known for its great Gateway Arch. So in this slide, you may see a DCI table that you are familiar with, in which we report student satisfaction with the coordination or integration of the content in the pre-clerkship phase. So when the Gateway curriculum was just launched in its first year, we started evaluating content threads at the end of phase 1 or pre-clerkship phase, as a way to examine the coordination of the content. And when examining the survey data, we noticed that there were students selecting do not know, not applicable, or they were not quite satisfied. And in reading student comments, we picked up that some students were not familiar with the concept of content threads. Next slide, please. Thank you, Eve. Okay, so in just a very brief example of the content threads, I've listed here anatomy, professional identity formation, and we have about 20 threads throughout our curriculum. So, and we all know that LCME very much emphasizes the horizontal and the vertical integration throughout the curriculum. So in this case, we tend to monitor the integration within each phase, that is within the pre-clerkship phase, within the clerkship phase, as well as across phases. So how pre-clerkship phase and clerkship phase works together. And I think we can move on to next slide. Okay, so in this slide, I like to talk about our plans when following the PDSA framework. So the first stage plan, as I mentioned earlier, when we were reviewing some of the earlier survey results from our internal surveys, we see students were not familiar with the idea of content threads. So during the plan stage, our goal is to make content threads obvious for students so they can see the intentional integration of the content within the pre-clerkship curriculum. And our measurement plan is we will just use our existing internal surveys to measure the changes. And during the next stage, there were actually several efforts happening at the same time. So I listed here a few efforts, one being the focus group. As Eve just mentioned, that we have regular focus groups going on monitoring the progress of the curriculum. So we use those focus groups as opportunities to gather feedback from students, from faculty, administration, and leadership about how they perceive the content threads in the curriculum. In addition, we made sure that in the learning management system, where students access probably multiple times a day to get their calendars to see what they're supposed to be doing this week, we make sure that each learning session are being tagged by content thread. So here I include a very small screenshot so we can see that this session is being tagged by threads. And also we designed those cool badges. You can see those two little red circles on the bottom there. So each badge is one thread. So student sort of as a graphic tool. So when students see those badges, they know this session is being tagged by a certain thread, so to increase the visibility of content threads. And now both the tagging and the badges are happening in the learning system, so students can see what threads each session is being tagged with. So another effort we're making is the working group, where we have people representing the thread leads, the course leads, and multiple teams on assessment and administration, where we all work together to make the threads more visible, to make our our later stages more streamlined, which I will come to the third stage, study. So within the working group, we developed a plan to streamline the evaluation process and the process of creating reports and the presentations. So in the third stage, what we did was essentially build upon what we do in the do stage. So for instance, I listed a few examples here in the surveys where we ask students to evaluate their experience with content threads. We tend to include a hyperlink where students can click the link and see what are some of the example sessions that are relevant, say the thread anatomy or the thread professional identity formation. And then there will be another opportunity for students to be reminded of the intentional integration throughout the curriculum. And also in the evaluation surveys, we added comment boxes for students, so they have the opportunity to provide comments if they have anything to say about their experience with a particular thread. And also with all the good data we collect regularly throughout our internal surveys, we make sure through our efforts with the working group, we make sure that those results go to thread leads in almost real time, so they can pivot in real time if it's needed. And in the last stage, act, we include the content thread evaluation into the end of phase report. So when we have the curriculum meetings, the team can see how the content threads have been doing throughout the whole pre-clerkship phase. And we also conduct a very thorough analysis on student comments, which usually serve as a very good basis for the team, for the curriculum team to develop plans for what to do next for continuous improvement. And all those reports, their presentations, they happen in meetings where thread leads are held accountable, so they can develop plans for proposed changes and that the big group can be a part of it. And as Dr. Colson just mentioned, that the PDSA cycle just does not end. So we clearly see some of the improvement we had from this effort, and we do have our plans for next step, which is, for instance, we'll have a bigger space for content threads to have bigger group discussions. And also, as I explained earlier, we also want to monitor the curriculum across phases. So from pre-clerkship going to clerkship phases. So we also would like to extend our efforts into into the clerkship phase, which will also be helpful to monitor for instance, the redundancies or gaps in the content. And I think we can advance now. Eve, that might be your third example now.
So thank you, Yaheng. So now we've had the space in the clinical setting example. Now we've had, and then Yaheng talked a lot about the threads and in a new curriculum, integrating the threads and making sure that that was all visible to the students. And that's a little bit more complex than the space in the clinical setting. It involves the students, it involves the thread leads, it involves the module leads, and making sure that all comes together in an effective way. And then I'm going to talk about one other example that's even more complex, which is disparities in grading. And so some of you all may have heard about this being an issue for many places, disparities in clinical grading. And this is an example here from a paper written by Ariane Teherani and her colleagues at UCSF. And I just wanted to point this out for a couple of reasons. One is because you see that they use the fishbone diagram as a way to figure out some of the underlying potential causes that led to the fewer honors and grades and awards that also have downstream consequences. This is a great paper if you haven't read it before. So I just wanted to mention that we used this same exact approach when we learned after our analyses back in 2018 that we too had disparities in grading outcomes. And so we created a commission that then used the fishbone diagram in the same way that Teherani and colleagues had done to try to understand at our institution what were the major factors or causes that were behind what we thought were issues related to disparities in grading, what might be causing it, and what might we do to address it. And so we've actually been doing some work in a larger QI approach, starting with this fishbone diagram that we created. And you'll see in our paper from 2020 in academic medicine, you can see a little bit about our thinking and how we came up with our approach to the disparities in outcomes. And this second, these list of 6 different multi-pronged approach to addressing disparities in outcomes will be found. We've got a paper coming up in August of this year in academic medicine, where it outlines how we addressed or trying to address disparities in grading outcomes at WashU. So very specifically, using the fishbone diagram, we came up with 6 different approaches in a multi-pronged approach to eliminate these disparities. So the 6 things that we have done, some of them have been done, some of them are still in process, but one was to create equitable access to exam preparation materials. So we found that, and many of you may be experiencing the same thing, that requires resources to prepare for exams, and it's expensive, and some of our students could access the prep materials and some couldn't. And so we were able to provide, we went to the students, figured out which resources were ones they wanted to use. UWorld was among them. Many of you may have heard of that. And we now provide access to all of our students for exam prep materials. Secondly, we did a complete overhaul of our assessment system. So we have a new program of assessment that came along with the Gateway curriculum. It's a competency-based program of assessment that it's amazing, in my opinion. I haven't seen anything quite like it elsewhere. I've been at Yale and at WashU, so I don't have I haven't been at so many institutions, but it's it's really uses the ACGME competencies as a framework, our EPOs as the overarching, and then the organization is the ACGME competencies. And then we have very specific assessments that are not just multiple choice tests in each of the different competencies across our EPOs. And we have a competency attainment committee, and we have a coaching groups that help the students to identify area gaps and areas that they need help. There's a robust student success team. And so we are going to pay really close attention to see how this impacts the disparities in outcomes. We also have added to our medical student curriculum by specifically having a very robust thread called the Health Equity and Justice thread throughout the curriculum that involves not only content, but also experiences, guided experiences in the community. Has an anti-racist lens and really helps students to get very comfortable with and know how to use trauma-informed care. We also have made a really strong effort to improve our learning environment. That also had its own commission to try to figure out how we can best improve that. That's a whole nother hour-long conversation, but we've really have a really nice process in place for that now. And then we also have made changes to how staff and faculty recruitment and retention practices to enhance diversity. So that really covers the 3 examples around QI in different complexities. And so just getting back to thinking about what you might do at your own institution, using this PDSA cycle, remembering the different things to do in each of these areas. Maybe take a second now to think about what you might want to improve upon. And that is really where I think we will end and have hopefully a nice discussion thinking about these issues and how we might be able to have a conversation around that. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. So if anybody has any questions right now for Eve or Yaheng, please feel free to unmute and fire away.
Could you comment a little bit on the process you went through to decide which things you were going to address when you were doing which things you were going to plan to address and how you sort of decided this would be important?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Are you, Catherine, are you specifically talking about for LCME purposes, the CQI, or just in general?
Probably just in general. I'm a clerkship director, and so we have lots of things to address, and I'm just wondering how what your process was on prioritizing things.
Yeah, great question. So I was a former clerkship director, so I understand how that is. And it's a constant sort of thinking about what to focus on. The first thing I would say is knowing that we had an LCME visit, we did want to make sure that we focused on the things that LCME cared about as we built our new clerkship system. And then as we would collect certain data, both to serve our purpose as a school, and then also to serve the LCME purpose, like mid-clerkship feedback, getting grades in on time, you know, that list, make sure you have the list that the LCME expects, because it's a bit of a long list for clerkship directors. And then we would follow that and bring those to the clerkship directors to address. So we used the LCME lens, and then we used our own school lens. So for example, and some of that overlaps. So we care a lot about how we do with our assessments and feedback. And so we care a lot about that as a school. And we also, the LCME also cares a lot about it. So those are the kinds of things we chose to include on our surveys. And then when they would light up as problematic, they would automatically come into a system of review. So our clerkship directors and all of the leadership get their feedback on the end of clerkship survey within 2 weeks of the end of every clerkship. So we could see where things were problematic and what we wanted to focus on. Does that help? So using our data to help us think about what to focus on.
Yeah, that's helpful. So you from above were helping the clerkships really decide what they would need to do. So you gave them some guidelines.
Yes, so we were working centrally. It's a really collaborative effort, and there are lots of stakeholders, so to speak. And so we, as with the clerkship directors and central administration, decided what questions we wanted to ask on the surveys, and then would bring the surveys back to say, this is not where we need it to be. And sometimes if things were problematic and we felt that it needed to be corrected quickly, we would there's certain things we talk about on a quarterly basis. So we bring it up quarterly to see how we're doing, like grades on time, mid-clerkship feedback, and some other, we also have been monitoring our logs regularly on a quarterly basis. Just certain things that are prone to slippage, we want to keep a close eye on. It requires a lot of communication, though, to make sure all the clerkship directors know that these are the things that we want to really make sure we stay on top of.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Eve, when you're communicating stuff to the clerkship directors, how often do you make sure that you include that communication to go to the clerkship administrator or clerkship coordinator? So that way they're well aware, because 9 times out of 10, they're probably the ones that are actually doing some of the data collection and things like that. So I'm just curious how much you involve them in the process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have them involved they were very involved in the build. And we have regular meetings that include them with the clerkship director. So they are very involved. And the one thing I didn't say, but kind of intuitively knew in my own head, is that we actually collected the data centrally and distribute it. So the clerkship coordinators are very involved in a lot of stuff in the clerkship level, like where the students are going and all of that, but the actual and sending out they're involved in making sure that the feedback to faculty gets sent out, but the actual end of clerkship evaluations are done centrally. So we are also able to keep a really close eye on where things are great and where we may be running into some issues. And we also coordinate across clerkships. So we've gotten a really nice culture that I've seen develop since I got here about 4 years ago, which is the clerkships talk to each other. So if one clerkship is having trouble with something like mid-clerkship feedback or whatever, and the other one looks like it's going really well, they talk to each other. What are you doing? How are you getting this to happen? What's your strategy?
Other questions? Hearing none. We can actually end a little bit early today. Thank you, both of you, very much for this great presentation. And can't do these webinar series without your help. So it's nice that you volunteered your time to do this. So thanks tremendously. And with that, I will turn off my recording and we're